I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to everybody here today to the launch of the summary findings of the National Teens Food Survey 2. So our format for this morning is I will start with a very short presentation, just reminding us of our food surveys and their applications and the specific methods for the National Teens Food Survey 2. And then I'll hand you over to Laura and Breach, who will take us through some of the key findings and the summary data from these surveys. And we will then move on to a panel discussion. So just a little bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions during my presentation or during Laura's or Breach's, please add those questions to the question and answer box throughout the presentations, and we will include them all together in the panel discussions. We would absolutely love if you want to share some of these preliminary findings on social media. And if you're going to do so, please use hashtag NTFS2 to tag any of your media sharings. And thank you very much for that. We always appreciate that. So just a very busy slide to start with. It gets busier at every launch. And this is a slide of where we are in terms of our Irish University Nutrition Alliance surveys to date. And our IUNA team have been collecting data on the food and beverage consumption of our Irish population groups since 1997. The first survey, and many of you here today are well aware of this, but the first survey was an All-Ireland survey, hence the North-South in the title of it, and it was an adult survey, and it put us on the roadmap of collecting these really important data. Very soon after that, in 2003 and 2004, when I actually joined the team myself, we collected data on the 5 to 12-year-olds. And this is the first time to have data of this type collected in Ireland for this age group. We then moved fairly swiftly on without much of a break, and in 2005 and 2006, we collected data on the National Teens Food Survey of 13 to 17-year-olds, and we'll be alluding a lot today to that survey, where we can take a look at what changes there are over the last 15 years. I think both Breach and myself would agree that we had a landmark survey in 2008-2010 when we got huge funding for the National Adult Nutrition Survey. And this was particularly poignant because the funding that we got for this survey allowed us to partner with another large survey or a large group to collect biochemical data as well. So for the first time, we weren't just collecting food and beverage intake data and health style data, but we were also adding to that some really, a biobank of biochemical samples. And this has been a really important turning point for us in our surveys. So that was the National Adult Nutrition Survey, and it was 1,500 adults between the age of 18 and 90. In the same funding call, we were able to look at our very young children, and again, the very first time this was done in Ireland, our 1 to 4-year-olds, and we collected data in the National Preschool Nutrition Survey in 2010-2011. And some of you here today, in fact, many of you here today will remember September 2019, when we were very lucky to be able to go live in the Ashling Hotel in Dublin to report our summary findings of the National Children's Food Survey 2. And again, it was really nice that day to be able to look back at the 15 years before it and see whether any changes and what has changed over that time. And that brings us to today, where we're going to look at our National Teens Food Survey 2 of 13 to 18-year-olds with data collected in 2019-20. And again, to look at that, look back at what has happened over the last 15 years in terms of their food and beverage intake and also their lifestyle. But we're not finished there. We have a team out on the road at the moment, just out in the last couple of months after lockdown, collecting new data for our National Adult Nutrition Survey 2. And we're really looking forward to welcoming you back in the future to share some summary findings from that. So without further ado, I'll maybe just move on from that and tell you what our surveys are about. And these surveys are designed for food safety and nutrition, and I'll come back to that in the next couple of slides to give you some idea of the applications for these surveys. Our main funders, who we're very grateful for, are the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine, and also of our users of data who understand our data and use it to answer their research questions. And some of these users would include the Food Safety Authority of Ireland, Safe Food, the Health Service Executive, Department of Health, our food industry, and also all our academic partners in Ireland and further afield. So to talk about the applications of IUNA surveys and where they feed into answering research questions in terms of policy, firstly, in terms of food safety, we use these surveys for dietary exposure to additives, pesticides, packaging materials, and contaminants. And we can only do that because of the really rich, detailed data that we collect. We collect all of our data, our food consumption data, at brand level, and more so than that, and I think there's probably a lot of field workers smiling here as I say this, but more than that, we collect the packaging that goes with it. We collect the packaging, we take photos of it, and it gets entered into databases. So we would have really, really rich databases of additives, pesticides, packaging materials, and contaminants and more from the packaging labels, which we can use then for dietary exposure to these components of the food. Our surveys also feed into nutrition policy and inform healthy eating guidelines. They inform obesity policy. We can look at portion size for the different population groups, and also dietary patterns that might be associated with increase or regular body weight. Our nutrition policy also moves towards food fortification and nutritional supplements, where we can look at the benefits and possible risks of our food supply in terms of addition of vitamins and minerals. As you may well know, we have a voluntary fortification policy for the most part in Ireland, and hence it's important to keep monitoring our foods and the micronutrients that are added to them. And we can do this again because of the detail of the data that we collect, and that we collect it at brand level, and that we collect all the packaging that goes with it, and that we have really good relationships with the food industry to get that information that we need in terms of what is actually being added to those foods. Our data is also very well used by the food industry in terms of development and promotion of healthier products. And again, a lot of these products will be targeted at certain age groups, population groups, and depending on the findings of surveys like this. So to bring us to today's survey, the NTFS2, and a little bit about the study design of this particular survey. So we surveyed 428 teenagers, 216 girls and 212 boys, aged between 13 and 18 years, and all from secondary schools across the Republic of Ireland, so nationally representative. The fieldwork phase started in March 2019 until March 2020. So first of all, we can see a seasonal balance, but also very importantly, we came off the field in March 2020, so all data shared today are pre-COVID. Our response rate for the survey was 57%, and the sample was demographically representative of the Irish population in terms of age group, gender, and urban-rural location, when we looked at it against the most recent census available to us, the 2016 census. As is the norm in a lot of these surveys, social class was high, so the social class of the family, and we had a higher proportion of professionals and a lower proportion of semi-skilled or unskilled workers within the survey. But please be reassured that all data presented today, unless we say otherwise, has been adjusted to reflect these, the social class. In terms of methodology, data were collected, food and beverage data were collected using a 4-day weight food diary, including 1 weekend day. As I said previously, the data were collected at brand level, with packaging collected for all foods consumed. The nutrient intakes were estimated using UK food composition tables, which would be appropriate for the Irish diet, and supplemented with the Irish food database for things like fortified foods, nutritional supplements, recipes, and foods that weren't common and weren't in the food composition tables. Our field workers called to the houses and measured heights, weights, percent body fat, waist and hip circumference. I can see you all smiling there as you remember, of teenagers and their parents. They also collected really detailed data via questionnaires of physical activity and eating behaviours. And again, for the first time in teenagers, we've collected biochemical data, and a single morning urine sample was collected, and also a phlebotomy sample which is going to be used for vitamin D, folate and iron status. So a very, very busy fieldwork period, as you can see. So in terms of the presentations today and the summary report, which will be available to you shortly, tomorrow I think, it's going to include food and nutrient intakes, body weight including the prevalence of overweight and obesity, physical activity and barriers to healthy eating. But you can be well assured, and again I think there's people smiling as I say this, there's a lot of analysis going on in the background, a lot of PhDs being written, masters being written, and a lot of research going on in the background. So today we're just sharing some summary findings, but be assured that you'll see some detailed methods and outcomes over the next few months. And again, just to be aware of where you can find them, www.iuna.net. So again, to thank the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine. I think unfortunately Helen and Nolene can't be with us today, but to ensure that we're thanking them for the continued funding of the surveys, which is critical to answer these research questions. And I really want to spend a minute on this slide and thank the research team, and particularly, and I'm actually going to look at a notebook here in case I get this wrong, which I know I won't, but I don't want to forget anyone. And I really want to specifically mention today the field workers, those on the ground that collected these data. I remember it well myself. I remember the launches where I got thanked, and I remember how appreciative I was. So you are the guys who got this together. So in UCD, to thank Sarah, Laura, Emma, and Evine. In UCC and NTU, to thank Grania, Joanna, and Abigail. And TUD, to thank Aisling. And also all the families and schools that participated in this really important survey. We'd like to thank them also. So that is it from me. Please feel free to share any findings that you find exciting, interesting, concerning at hashtag NTFS2. And I'm going to pass you, I think, to Aisling, and she will pass you to Laura from there.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Jeanette, for that introductory presentation. I'd just like to reiterate what Jeanette said, that at any point anybody has any questions, comments or queries, if you just pop them in the Q&A box, and we'll address them during our panel discussion towards the end of today's webinar. So now I'm going to pass over to Laura. Laura is from the School of Food and Nutritional Sciences at University College Cork, and Laura is going to talk us through what Irish teenagers are eating, current intakes and changes over time.
Thanks very much, Aisling. I'm just going to share here now. Great. Hi everyone, thanks very much for joining us today, and I'm delighted to be here on behalf of the whole team presenting on the current intakes of foods, beverages and nutrients. So the first thing I'm going to take a look at is the food and beverage intakes, and in the second half of the presentation we'll take a look at the nutrient intakes that subsequently are impacted by these foods and beverages. So just to start off, what are the staple foods that are consumed by teenagers in Ireland? So the staple foods are ones that are consumed by almost all children in sufficient quantities that they make important contributions to nutrient intakes. So the staple foods that we found in the diets of Irish teenagers are breads, potatoes and cereals, milk and milk products, meat and meat products, fruits and vegetables. So as I go through this presentation, I'm going to take a little section on each of these staple foods and give you the top line messages and the main messages that are coming out of these groups. So firstly, to take a look at bread intake. So 96% of teenagers consumed bread during the survey. And on here, I'm going to have the graph, which I'm going to have the current survey, the NTFS 2 on the left-hand side, and then I'll have the older survey from 2005 to 2006 on the right-hand side for comparisons purposes. And this will be the format for all of the graphs throughout. So firstly, to take a look at the current intakes. So currently, teenagers are consuming about 2 slices of bread per day, but you can see here that it's mostly as white bread. So 57 grams is consumed as white bread, 18 grams as wholemeal or brown bread, and 9 grams as other breads, for example, garlic bread, scones, etc. And how does this compare to the previous survey almost 15 years ago? So we can see that overall bread intake is quite similar to 15 years ago. However, there has been a small reduction in white bread consumption, with similar contributions from wholemeal, brown breads and other breads. But the main take-home message out of the current survey is that they are still consuming mostly white bread. In terms of the other forms of cereals, so cereals and potatoes, we had 67% consumers of potatoes and 96% consumers of pasta, rice and savouries. So here on the left-hand side, you can see the current intake. So the average intake of pasta, rice and savouries was 128 grams per day, and the average intake of potatoes was 84 grams per day. So the potato contribution was coming almost equal contributions from chipped, fried and roasted potatoes and boiled, baked and mashed potatoes. And then the pasta, rice and savouries, this is coming from your pasta, your rice. The savouries we're talking about are things like fried rice, savoury rice, or your instant noodles. Pizza was also a contributor in here. And then other cereals were less commonly consumed, like your couscous or your quinoa. And how does this compare to 15 years ago? Well, overall, you can see that the intake of cereals and potatoes is quite similar, but we have a big shift. There has been a reduction in the intake of potatoes and potato products. And this reduction was across all categories, as I mentioned, the chipped, fried and roasted and the boiled, baked and mashed and the other potato products. And then we've had an increase in the pasta, rice and savouries to counteract this. So for example, there was an increase across all categories: pasta, rice, savouries, pizza. In terms of milk intake, we had 84% consumers of milk, and they were consuming milk in any form, whether it was as a beverage or added to cereal or to teas. And here we can see that the current intake of milk is about 172 grams, but mostly as whole milk. So this is just under a glass or a serving of milk, and about 107 grams is coming from whole milk. 43 grams is coming from low-fat milk, 17 grams from 1% and skimmed milk, and just 5% from non-dairy alternatives. These non-dairy alternative milks were consumed by less than 5% of the population. And in comparison to the previous survey, we can see that there has been a reduction in the intake of milk, in particular the reduction in the intake of whole milk, and a small increase in the percent of, or in the consumption of 1% and skimmed milk. In terms of meat intake, 98% of teenagers consumed meat. And you can see that the intake was about 160 grams per day. And this was coming from meat dishes, 62 grams, fresh meat, 44 grams, processed meat, 60 grams. So the fresh meat, the most common types of fresh meat consumed was poultry and beef. And then in terms of processed meat, this is typically your processed meat products that you're all familiar with. And then about 15 grams came from things like bacon and ham. And in comparison to the previous survey, we can see that overall meat consumption is very similar to that in 2005, 2006. A very slight increase in the intake of meat dishes, but the other categories, fresh meat and processed meat, have remained very similar. And in terms of fish, which isn't on this slide, we had about 30% consumers of fish. Mostly it was consumed as coated fish and a small portion as oily fish, but just about 30%. In terms of fruit and vegetable intake, all children or teenagers consumed fruit and vegetables. And the intake was about 217 grams per day. So these are quite low intakes in comparison to the recommendations. The recommendation is 5 to 7 portions per day, or 400 grams minimum. And at 217 grams per day, you can see that we had less than 3 servings per day in this teenage population. And where was this coming from? So here in the graph, you can see in the blue, this is fruit. So this is whole fruit or discrete fruit. About 67 grams was coming from whole fruit. 47 grams came from fruit juices and smoothies. A small proportion, 9%, came from fruit in composite dishes. And then in the yellow and the green, you can see the intake of vegetables. There was a roughly equal contribution from discrete vegetables and vegetables that were hidden in composite dishes. So 47 grams from discrete veg and 48 grams from vegetables in composite dishes. So it's really important to note that these teenagers are getting vegetables from their composite meals and not just those that are very visible on the plate. And how does this compare to the previous survey? Overall, there has been a slight reduction in fruit and vegetable intake. Within the individual categories, if you take a look at fruit in the blue, there has been an increase in whole fruit consumption. In terms of fruit juices and smoothies in the orange, there has been a reduction in the fruit juices and smoothies, primarily fruit juice reduction. Fruit and composite dishes, a small reduction. And then discrete vegetables and composite dishes, overall veg is quite similar, with a slight increase in the contribution from vegetables and composite dishes. And then in terms of confectionery and snack intake, so while these were consumed by 100% of teenagers in the survey, there was an average daily intake of 80 grams, and this is quite similar to previously when it was 87 grams per day. The confectioneries and snacks, they were consumed in all forms. The most common ones were biscuits, cakes and pastries, the chocolate, dessert, savoury snacks. The other kind of forms were sweets and jellies, sugars, preserves, chocolate spreads, cereal bars, and then protein bars were consumed by just 2% of teenagers. In terms of beverages, water was the most commonly consumed beverage. So over 94% of teenagers consumed water, with an average daily intake of 850 ml. Other beverages that were consumed included soft drinks. So here on the left-hand side, you can see overall soft drink consumption was about 150 grams per day, or 150 mils per day. You can see 83 grams of this came from added sugar, and 56 grams came from no added sugar. When we look at this in comparison to the previous survey, overall there has been a reduction in soft drink intake, and in particular a big reduction in soft drinks from with added sugar. Other beverages that were consumed include milk as a beverage, tea, fruit juices. There was about 30% consumers of each of those categories. Coffees were consumed by about 18%. And then energy drinks were consumed by 6% of teenagers. And then in terms of supplement use, so 14% of teenagers took a supplement during the recording period. And this is lower than it was in the previous survey when it was 24% of teenagers taking a nutritional supplement or a food supplement. But of these 14% of teenagers, what type of supplements were they taking? So 22% of supplements that were consumed were multivitamin and mineral supplements. 16% of supplements were of single vitamin. So for example, vitamin C, vitamin D, and vitamin E. 13% of supplements were fish oils. 13% of supplements were protein and creatine. This was primarily protein powders, whether it was made up with milk or water, or sometimes the powder added to a meal. Single mineral supplements made up 10% of the supplements that were used. So the single mineral supplements we're talking about here are iron, magnesium, and iodine primarily. And then a vitamin and mineral combination supplement was made 7% of the supplements. And for example, we're talking about vitamin D and calcium, or vitamin C and zinc supplements here. And then multivitamins made up 6%, botanical or herbal supplements 5%, probiotics 3%, and then other supplements was 5%. But just to remember that these were taken by just 14% of teenagers. So now we've looked at the staple foods, the supplements, and the confectionery intake in this population group. And now it's important to have a look at what impact has this had on energy and nutrient intakes and compliance with goals. So first of all, we'll take a look at energy intake. So the average daily energy intake was about 1,800 calories in this population group. And the key sources were meat and meat products, 18%, grains, rice and pastas, 12%, breads and rolls contributed 12% of energy intake, sugars, confectionery, preserves and savoury snacks contributed 9%, potatoes, breakfast cereals, biscuits, cakes and pastries, and milk and yogurt each contributed 7%, and then the other food groups made up the remaining 21% of energy intake. The top shelf foods contributed 18% of energy intake. So when we talk about top shelf foods, we're talking about these sugars, confectionery, preserves and savoury snacks, our biscuits, cakes and pastries, and our sugar sweetened drinks. So 18% of energy intake was being contributed by these top shelf foods. In terms of calories consumed outside the home, 19% of calories consumed by teenagers were consumed outside the home. And while this is lower than it was in the previous survey, when it was 25% of calories, this still represents a fifth of their energy intake. Where was our energy intake coming from? So if we look at the breakdown of protein, fat and carbohydrate. So 17% of energy was contributed from protein intake. And the typical source of protein were your meat products, contributing almost 40% of protein intake. Total fat contributed 35% of energy intake, with your typical sources being meat and meat products and sugars, confectionery, preserves and savoury snacks. And then the carbohydrate group made up 48% of energy intake, with your sources being the typical ones that you'd expect, your breads and rolls and your grains, rice and pastas. So where does this fit within guidelines? For fat, the UK Department of Health, updated by SACN, recommend an average population intake of 35% of energy from total fat. And you can see that these teenagers have intakes in line with these recommendations. For carbohydrate, the UK Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition, SACN, recommend an average population intake of 50% of energy. So the carbohydrate intakes are just below these recommendations. And then to take a look at the dietary quality within these nutrients and what's going on. So first we'll take a look at saturated fat. So here we have a similar graph again with the new survey, the current survey on the left-hand side and the older survey on the right-hand side. And you can see that the percent energy coming from saturated fat in the current survey was 14%, which is very similar to previous when it was 15%. And overall, these intakes are much higher than recommendations. It's recommended that saturated fat intake should be less than 10% of total energy intake. The key sources of saturated fat for teenagers were meat and meat products, 22%, milks, 11%, sugars, confectionery, preserves and savoury snacks, a further 10%. In terms of free sugar intake, so free sugars, just for those of you who aren't as familiar with this, they're all mono or disaccharides added to foods by the manufacturer, the consumer or the cook. They're also the sugars that are naturally occurring in unsweetened fruit juices, honeys and syrups. So here you can see on the left-hand side, the current intake in Irish teenagers is 9% of total energy intake. So the UK SACN advised that the average population intake should be less than 5% of energy from free sugars. So you can see that our intakes in the population are above these recommendations. The WHO give an individual guideline for less than 10% of energy. And when we looked at this at an individual level, we found that 30% of teenagers had a free sugar intake that was greater than this 10% of energy recommendation. But when we compare this to the previous survey, we can see that there has been a reduction in free sugar intake. Previously, 14% of energy was coming for free sugar, and now it's reduced to 9%. This reduction is primarily due to the reduction in sugar sweetened soft drinks. And the overall key source of free sugar for these teenagers were our top shelf foods, contributing almost 60%. So sugars, confectionery, preserves, savoury snacks contributing 31%, our biscuits, cakes and pastries contributing 17%, and the beverages, sugar sweetened beverages contributing 14% of free sugar intake. Other sources included breakfast cereals and creams, ice creams and chilled desserts. In terms of dietary fibre, which is important for all age groups for normal bowel function, you can see here that the average intakes of dietary fibre were 17 grams per day, which is similar to the previous survey when it was 16 grams per day. However, the European Food Safety Authority recommends an adequate intake of 19 to 25 grams per day for these age groups. So we can see that intakes are well below these recommendations. The key sources of dietary fibre were breads and rolls, 19%, grains, rice, pastas and savouries, 14%, breakfast cereals, 13%, and potatoes and potato products, 11%. In terms of salt intake, so as Jeanette mentioned in her presentation, we took first void morning spot urine samples from the teenagers. And from these, we're able to estimate sodium excretion or salt excretion values. And preliminary analysis of these data suggests that mean daily salt intake is 6 grams per day. And this is higher than the recommendations. So urinary salt allows us to estimate all of the salt from foods and also that which was added at the table or in cooking. In order to compare to the previous survey, we can look at the dietary intake. So this is just the salt which is contained within the food, not that which is added at cooking or at the table. And we can see here on the left-hand side, the current intake from food sources only is 5 grams per day, which is a gram lower than previously, which was 6 grams per day. So this is a positive reduction in salt intake in line with the strategies that are ongoing across Ireland and the food industry and the FSAI. And what were the key sources of salt? So these key sources of salt, they're quite similar to the sources that we see in all of the population groups across Ireland, and meat products contributing 29%, with our processed meat being the biggest contributor in here of about 17%. Breads and rolls contributed 18% of salt intake, and then your grains, rice and pastas contributed 10%. So now we've looked at dietary quality in terms of the macronutrient breakdown, dietary fibre and salt. What is the micronutrient picture? So in order to look at the prevalence of inadequate micronutrient intakes, we looked at the proportion of teenagers with intakes below the estimated average requirement. So here you can see in the graph for vitamin D, 94% of teenagers had inadequate intakes of vitamin D when compared to the Institute of Medicine estimated average requirement of 10 micrograms per day. 51% of teenagers had inadequate intakes of calcium. So together, 94% inadequate in vitamin D and 51% inadequate in calcium. This is really important at this age group when they're laying down their bone mass and trying to reach their peak bone mass for later in life. In terms of other micronutrients, 48% of teenagers had inadequate intakes of vitamin C, 32% had inadequate intakes of dietary folate equivalents, vitamin A, 28% had inadequate intakes, 20% had inadequate intakes of riboflavin, and 14% had inadequate intakes of vitamin B6. And furthermore, 9% of teenage girls had inadequate intakes of iron. And as Jeanette mentioned previously in her presentation, we did collect blood samples which are being analysed for vitamin D, folate and iron. And hopefully over the coming months when these results are available, it'll be very nice to combine these with the dietary and get the full picture of how that is impacting their status as well. In terms of the key sources of vitamins and minerals, key sources included milk and milk products for the obvious ones such as your calcium, your riboflavin. Meat and meat products were important contributors to vitamin D, B6 and iron. Breads, potatoes and cereals. So your breads were important contributors to intakes of calcium and iron due to the calcium and iron that's added to the wheat flour in Ireland. Potatoes made important contributions to vitamin C. And cereals, particularly our fortified breakfast cereals, made really important contributions to intakes of vitamin D, the B vitamins, riboflavin, B6, folate, and also iron. And then our fruits and vegetables made important contributions to vitamin C, vitamin A, and folate. So just to summarize the overall findings from the food and nutrient intakes in these teenagers, overall they have low intakes of fruit and vegetables, about less than 3 servings per day, which is well below the recommendations. They have a high consumption of biscuits, confectionery and savoury snacks, high intakes of saturated fat, sugar and salt, low intakes of dietary fibre, and low intakes of vitamin D, calcium, vitamin C, folate, vitamin A, riboflavin and B6. But the key changes that we've seen since the last survey in 2005-2006 was this decrease intake in milk, particularly total milk and coming from whole milk. This decrease intake of potatoes coming from all forms of potatoes such as chipped, fried and roasted and boiled and baked and mashed. A reduction in fruit juice consumption and this reduction in sugar sweetened soft drinks. They've also reduced their intake of sugar and salt. However, these two nutrients are still above recommendations, so we have further steps to go, but we're on the right track. And in terms of other foods that have increased, the increased intake of pasta, rice and savouries, the increase of whole fruit and water. Thank you very much for listening, and as any questions, pop them into the question and answers and we'll answer them in the panel. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Laura, for that very comprehensive presentation. Our next speaker this morning is Bríd McNulty from the Institute of Food and Health at University College Dublin. And Bríd is going to take us through the body weight and lifestyle of Irish teenagers, current status and changes over time.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Aisling. Can you now see my full screen just to check? Perfect. All right. So thank you, first of all, for everyone attending today. I'm delighted to be able to present the data from the National Teen Food Survey, our second one. And following on from Laura's talk, what I want to do over the next 20 or 30 minutes is to talk through, I suppose, the weight status of our Irish teenagers, where we're at, and I suppose the changes that we've observed since our previous teen survey, and also look preliminary at the lifestyle factors as well. So if we get started and we start with the weight status itself. As Jeanette alluded to earlier on, we collect multiple measurements from during our surveys, and we did it also obviously in our teens. So we were able to collect our weight and height. So we used a Taneto to measure the weight and height, the stadiometer, and from that we were able to calculate our body mass index from our teenagers. But for the first time, we were able to also collect percentage body fat. So we were able to measure this via the Taneto and also collect hip and waist circumference. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these results today. I'd be here too long, but just to note that the body fat measurements, the hip and waist circumference measurements, we have data on them in the summary report and further data to be released later on in the year. So I'm going to focus really on the body mass index and how that relates to weight status. So I suppose it's no surprise to anyone when we talk about trying to assess obesity in younger children and in our adolescents. It's very complex. And when we're talking about teenagers and they go through puberty, their body composition changes. So we have to note that. And there are many different methods that we can use to assess weight status. We can use, in the UK, they use the UK 90, or there's WHO cutoffs that use centiles. But more commonly, and I suppose more internationally used now, is the International Obesity Task Force method, which is the IOTF. And just to note, I suppose, depending on which method you use, you're going to get slightly different rates of prevalence. But in the purposes of this presentation, it's obviously the IOTF. So also just to give a bit of background about the IOTF measurement, so it's Tim Cole who has, and his colleague has developed this method. And it's looked at BMI at 18, so in a cohort of across 6 countries. And it's linked that back to younger ages to 18 years. And they're age and sex specific. So you can see here from the graphs that depending on where your BMI would sit and which category you would be in, this links back depending on males and females and the age group. So this is the method that we have used. So now on to the results themselves. So when we looked at the weight status of our teenagers in the NTFS2, what we found was 24% of them were being classified as having overweight or obesity, with 16% overweight and 8% having obesity. And then 71% were classified in the normal weight range. So you can see that here in the graph. Again, when we looked at this split by gender, so we can see here our teenage girls, our teenage boys, very equally split. There was no real difference in trends here that we were seeing. So again, 71% in both were classified in the normal weight range, and 16% of girls and 15% of boys were classified as overweight, and both 8% in both as having obesity. So what we wanted to do then is really to have a look and compare with data in Ireland. So we always want to see how we relate to other data that have looked at, or other studies that have looked at adolescents. And one study that has done that is the Growing Up in Ireland study. So they're a longitudinal study that have, looked at cohorts throughout their life, and they've taken them at 13 years, and they've also looked at them at 16 or 17 and 18 years. And these are the two cohorts that we've pulled out to compare our data with. And as you can see from this graph here, it compares very nicely with that data as well. So we're very comparative. We've similar rates when we look at this growing up in Ireland cohort at 13 years of age and at 17 to 18 years of age. It's 26% at 13 and 28% in both of them at 17 to 18 years. Then what we wanted to do is go further afield and really look at the prevalence of overweight and obesity internationally or across the water really. So we wanted to compare it with the UK data that they have. So the UK in the equivalent survey, the National Diet Nutrition Survey that they have, they also measure weight status of their population. They have a rolling survey, so they collect data every year, and for their adolescents they have collected it from 2012 and 13 to 2016 and 17, and they've collected it on their 11 to 18-year-olds. So when we mapped it across, and just to note here, you'll see different rates or prevalence of overweight and obesity here. And this is what I referred to earlier. They use slightly different cutoffs. So they don't use the IOTF, they use their UK 90 population cutoffs to classify weight status, and it classifies it slightly higher prevalence. And it relates more so to the risk of potentially getting overweight and obesity. So what we see here is, again, very comparable. When we look at our girls, we're compared 32% prevalence of overweight and obesity. And again, 30, we're slightly lower when it comes to boys when we compare it to the UK, but still very comparative, 30% versus 35%. So next, what we wanted to do is really look back. So when we look at the NTFS, where we were 15 years ago, what do we see? And we see a change, but not a positive change. So the prevalence of overweight and obesity is higher in the current study compared to the NTFS. So it was 18%, or those that were classified as having overweight or obesity was 18% in 2005 and 6, and now what we see is that it's 24%. And you can see the breakdown there into the different categories, and we can see that the changes really relate to the normal weight category. So that's a reduction of participants being, or teenagers being classified as having normal weights from 79 to 71%. Overweight prevalence hasn't changed that much. You can see it's quite similar across both surveys, but it is really the obesity. So those being classified as having obesity has risen. So it was 3% in 2005 and 2006, and now what we can see, it has risen to 8%. And then what we wanted to do, of course, is split this between our teenage males, our teenage boys and teenage girls, to see, is it the same pattern? And really it is. So what we can see here is just focusing on the boys and the change over time in boys. Again, it was 18% in boys also in 2005 and 2006. And it now is 23% in boys that are classified as having overweight or obesity. Again, when we look at where the change is, it's the same pattern. There was a drop in those being classified as normal weight, 81 to 71%. And then if we follow up and look at the obesity, it's risen from 2% rate to an 8%. And when we split this into our girls or our teenage girls, it's a similar story. So there's no difference. So again, it was very similar in the older NTFS across genders. It was both 18% in both genders. It's risen to 24% when we look at it in the NTFS2, and we can see the same trend, a reduction in normal weight and an increase in the teenagers that are now being classified as having obesity. So again, risen to 8%. And I suppose just to bring it back to the raw data as such, so that's weight status, but we also wanted to look at our BMI. So what's changing in our BMI? And this is just again comparing boys and girls between the NTFS and NTFS2. And what we can see is there is a significant increase. Now it is less than 1 unit. So we can see that from 21.3 kilograms per meter squared in boys now is the average BMI that we're observing is 21.8. So that's a significant increase, and the same with girls. 21.8 was the previous that we were seeing, and now it's an average of 22.7 kilograms per meter squared. And this is in contrast, I have to say, to what we reported on the children. So if you remember back, when we looked at children, what we did see is that we didn't find that significant difference in BMI between our boys, and we actually saw a decrease in our BMI in our girls. So we're not seeing the same change, we're actually seeing this increase in our teenagers. And the next thing I think we all want to know, and it's not new, I suppose, but when we split our weight status by social class, what kind of pattern do we find? And of course, we do see a dramatic pattern when we split it by social class. So I suppose to look at this, we've split it based on the census social class categories. So if we just look at our higher versus our lower, or two extremes in this, what we can see is that 80% of families from a higher social class were being classified as normal weight, and overall 15% were classified as having overweight and obesity. Stark contrast to those families that are classified as having a lower social class, with 59% being classified in the normal weight category, and just near 40% being classified as having overweight and obesity. So it's really, I suppose, a stark finding, but not a new finding. We do see this, and we have seen this in our children and in adults as well, that there is this disparity between weight status and social class. So next, I want to take you on and show you some of the results in terms of the physical activity data that we collected. So we estimated physical activity, so we didn't directly measure it. Unfortunately, in these surveys, although we'd love to measure everything, we can't, but we did do an indirect measurement of physical activity, and that was by the use of the Youth Physical Activity Questionnaire, the YPAC. And we looked at our 13-year-olds using this physical activity questionnaire. And just to note, it's the same questionnaire we would have used in our older children as well, so we can compare across the surveys in that way. And what it does is it estimates the time spent in obviously physical activities, but also helps us to estimate the time spent in sedentary behaviours or sedentary activities as well, which is really important. And also the it includes screen time, which again is very topical and something that we need to understand more about. So when we did this, what did we find? Okay, so what we did see was that 81%, 81 minutes per day were the average amount or medium amount of minutes that were being spent in physical activity across the total population. And when we split this by gender, it was very equivalent. So you can see 80 for boys, 81 for females. When we looked at sedentary activity, what you can see is that 455 minutes per day were actually being spent in sedentary activities. So sedentary activities would be like listening to music, reading, for example. So obviously very minimal amount of energy expenditure going on in these type of activities. And the difference that you can see here, it's a small difference, but when we looked at it split by gender, what we can see is girls tended to spend slightly more time in sedentary activities. So 474 minutes per day versus 442 minutes per day. And I suppose, what does this mean in terms of the recommendations? So the recommendation is currently the WHO recommend that children should be daily spending at least 60 minutes of their time in physical activity, so moderate to vigorous activities. And when we applied this cutoff, what we did find was 67% of the teenagers in the NTFS2 met the recommendation. So, you know, that was a real, high majority of them were meeting that recommendations. And again, equivalent between genders. We also looked at another recommendation. So in the UK, the NICE have a recommendation about screen time usage. And they recommend that daily, there should be less than 120 minutes per day being spent on screen. And when we applied this recommendation to our cohort, what we found that actually only 21% of the cohort actually met this recommendation. So there's quite a bit of time being spent in these sedentary activities. So what type of activities were they doing? So when we looked at the frequency of activities that were coming up, no surprise in terms of the boys, football was the most frequently activity that teenage boys were partaking in, with 52% of the cohort partaking in football. And the average amount of time that was being spent here was about just over an hour. And the next most popular one was running, 38% partaken in running on a weekly basis, and that was an average about 30 minutes being spent there. And then 20% recorded that they spent time in the gym, and again about 40 minutes being spent in the gym activities. For girls, the top one that was coming out here was running. So 45% of the NTFS2 girls said they partake in running. And again, it was about 30 minutes that they were spending in this activity. 29% spent time in dancing. And again, it was about an hour being spent in dancing. And lovely to see, 24% of our girls were spending time playing football during the previous week. And again, it was slightly lower in about 30 minutes in this activity for girls. So that's, I suppose, our physical activity. But what about our more sedentary activities? So this is what we found is that when we looked at TV watching, no surprise, I suppose, but 93% of boys and girls reported that they were watching TV. 76% of boys versus 11% of girls. So a very difference in gender here. So one of the bigger differences that we do see, we're playing computer games on a weekly basis. And then 91% of boys and 95% of girls reported that they used their computer or their tablet during the previous week. So moving on from there, now to talk just a small bit about eating behaviours. So what were the behaviours that came across in this cohort? So what we did was we asked the teenagers as part of one of the questionnaires to really, is it difficult to eat healthily? And what we found was 76% of the teenagers answered that yes, it was, or sometimes it was difficult to eat healthy. So that's important to know that they do find it difficulty in having a healthy diet. So the next thing we wanted to know is, okay, well, what are the barriers in terms of eating healthy? And what we found here was that it was no surprise, I suppose, because we have seen this in the other surveys. So we've seen it in preschoolers, we've seen it in our children, and now in our adolescents, is that likes and dislikes top the list. So 57% of our teenagers found that it was their likes or dislikes was a barrier to try and eating healthy. Next up was convenience. So 52%, so just over half of the cohort, found that it was convenience that was the barrier. And this was followed closely enough by availability of food. So 35% thought the availability of the food itself made it a barrier. Again, this was followed by cost. 29% of our cohort thought it was cost was a barrier. Food advertisement came in at 25%. And whereas 14% of our teenagers found that it was allergies actually that was the barrier to trying eating healthy. So I'm going to, just to summarize, I suppose, those main points from this presentation. It is important to note, I suppose, that now almost 1/4 of our teenagers are classified as having overweight or obesity. And we have seen that increase in recent years. So we have seen that increase from 18% to 24% now classified as having overweight or obesity. Importantly though, 2/3 of the population have met the recommendation of spending more than 60 minutes in physical activities, with an average of 81 minutes being spent being physically active, which is really important. And finally, when we asked the teenagers what they themselves were perceiving as the main barriers to eat that healthy diet, it was their likes and dislikes, it was the convenience of food and the availability of food. So they were the three top ones that came across. So I'm going to leave it there now, and I'm going to let Aisling take over.
Thanks very much, Breach, for that presentation. And that concludes all of our presentations for this morning. So just want to say a big thank you to all of our speakers, 3 excellent presentations. I'd just like to now invite the members of our panel to unmute themselves, turn on your camera. So just to introduce our panel this morning, we have Professor Albert Flynn from University College Cork. We have Professor John Carney from Technological University Dublin. We have Dr. Jeanette Walton from Munster Technological University. We have Dr. Breach McNulty from University College Dublin, and we have Dr. Laura Keogh from University College Cork. So we have a couple of questions that have come in throughout the presentations, and if anyone else has any questions, feel free to pop them in the Q&A. So I'll get started and read a question which came in from Mary. And Mary has asked around savouries, the food group savouries. So what exactly are savouries? And does this food group contain fat? So maybe, Laura, you might be best placed to answer that question.
Yeah, thanks, Aisling, and thanks, Mary, for the question. So that savouries category that we were talking about there, that's products such as our savoury dishes, so our savoury fried rice, some savoury pasta dishes, but what's really in there is the other savouries, like French toast, you know, the nice savouries that people have. So that's the savouries, and yes, there is a contribution from fat coming from those groups, things like waffles as well, and the instant noodles, you know, the pot noodles and the cocoa noodles, those kind of products. If anyone wants to add.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks very much, Laura, for your answer there. We have another question which is also directed towards yourself, Laura, and this comes in from Katrina. And she's just stated that there's been a significant reduction in free sugars in intake since 2005 and 2006. I'm wondering if this is all attributable to sugar sweetened beverage intake, or do we think that other factors have contributed? So things like change in consumption of habits overall, or reformulation more broadly across food products. So I'll direct that to you, Laura, but of course, if anyone else wants to jump in as well.
Yeah. So based on the data we can see, so it is primarily one of the categories it's attributable to is that reduction in sugar sweetened beverages. They were one of the top contributors back in 2005, 2006, and now they're the second one. Sugars confectionery have stayed up in the top category, so there hasn't been much of a shift in consumption patterns of those. Another category in there is the fruit juice consumption. So that fruit juice having been reduced is a big contributor there as well. Not quite as big as the sugar sweetened beverages, but it is existing. And then for the other categories, for example, breakfast cereals, there has been some reformulation. They're still in there, but there's a slight lower contribution. But it's a mixture of reformulation, some changes in patterns of consumption, not necessarily all, because they're still consuming a lot of, they're all consuming confectionery and things like that. So it's a little bit of a mixture, but the sugar sweetened beverages are a big contributor in there. There was such a reduction in those particularly, and a shift towards the no added sugar versions. And if anyone wants to log in.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much, Laura, for your answer. We have a question here which is more towards your presentation, Breach, and it's wondering, is there any possibility that obesity might have been underestimated in 2005 and 2006, seeing that increase in the new survey?
I suppose it's a good question. Did we underestimate it at that point? But the methods that we used in the NTFS are equivalent to the methods that we were using in the NTFS 2. And that the NTFS was, I suppose, representative of the national population at that point as well. So I don't perceive that we have underestimated back then. I do think it is actually an increase. And just reading some of the literature in Europe, they have seen in other countries that there seems to be either a stabilization in their teens, but also countries have observed that increase. And is it potentially that we have done a lot for our children, and you know, we did see it in our children. We saw that stabilization, and as I said, in females we actually saw that reduction. And you know, there's been lots of strategies put in place, and I think they've been very successful because we do see that good news. But do we need to, you know, refocus somewhat on our adolescents and look at them now in more depth? And I suppose when we compare it to growing up in Ireland, they were seeing the same rates, which is important. So I think it's something that we need to address.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks very much, Breach. We have another question here, and this is from Rebecca, and she's saying, thank you for the great presentations. And just with reference to the reduction of milk and milk product intake, did we see any differences in gender in these intakes? For example, are girls consuming less milk than boys perhaps? So Laura, I think you might be best placed for that question.
Yeah, we haven't got a full enough time really to delve into this in detail. We were working right up until yesterday really on these. So provisionally I can't give a direct answer to that, but we will have main results on the website very soon, and the summary report will be available soon as well. Rebecca, get in touch with me in the next couple of days and I'll be able to directly answer that. No problem.
Okay, that's great. And thank you very much, Laura. And I'm assuming there's just another question here from Sarah, and she's similar question around fruit and vegetable. So was there any increase in fruit and vegetable intake among certain groups? But I'm assuming it's probably a similar answer. I haven't got to that stage yet.
Yeah, I would. So these were just preliminary data that we're presenting today. We just haven't had the opportunity to delve into looking at boys, girls, social class and things like that. And there's a lot of PhD work and different things going on. So there will be a lot coming out in the next couple of months in that area.
Keep watching the IUNA website for the updates there. And just seeing, we have just a comment more so than a question from another attendee. So there's just saying that it's interesting that the rates in overweight and obesity have reduced in children but have increased in teens, and that the next iteration of NTFS, which will be great if we get to that stage, will be interesting to see if there are any improvements in children carrying on into their teenage years, and to see the new rates in the upcoming NANs. So I don't know if any of our panelists have would like to add to that discussion or broaden it at all, or just, but it is an interesting point.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and you know, you would hope that you would see that good work that we're seeing in terms of children carry on into adolescence, but I still think we need to focus on it. You know, it's a time when teenagers become more independent in their eating patterns, and we really need to support that. And even though we did see a decrease in children, it's still quite high. It's not to forget that. And also, you know, we do see that dramatic increase when we go on to adulthood as well. So we, you know, it's a good point, and hopefully we might see the benefits, but it's not to, still think we need to focus and have the strategies in that group as well.
Yes, definitely, I agree there. We have another question that's come in from Mary. So she's just wondering, do you think it's a concern that 13% of teenagers are using protein and creatine products as supplements, where this can be such an unregulated area? So I'm not sure exactly who might be best placed to answer that, but I'll leave it open.
Yeah, I can jump in there. So so just to say and make it clear, so only 14% of teenagers were taking supplements overall, and that pie chart was then the types of supplements. So it's not actually 13% taking those protein and creatine supplements. It's of the 14% of teenagers, 13% of the supplements were those. And so we're really looking at a very, very small proportion of the population. I suppose what I can say, I see Claire is in the audience from the FSAI, and you know, they do a lot of work in this area in terms of regulation and supplements that are available on the market. So, you know, while there is a certain amount of regulation, maybe the only concern might be if they're sourcing them, you know, online or something that isn't in a regulated environment. But definitely, I know that's a big area that Claire in particular is working on. So I think the main message is to remember that it's still a very small proportion. It's not 13%. So sorry if I didn't make that clear.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, Laura. So we have another question that's come in from Marianne. And she's just wondering, has the reduction in milk intake been offset by water intake? And a follow-up question to that, has all dairy intake been reduced or just milk?
Yeah, I can jump in there, and Jeanette might want to jump in if she wants. But yeah, so the water intake has increased over the past, since the previous survey. In terms of overall dairy, cheese and yogurt consumption has remained quite similar. Butter and spreading fats, there has been a reduction. Primarily, butter has stayed almost the same, and it's the spreading fats that have reduced. So it's mostly from the milk category that we have seen that reduction there, yeah. If anyone wants to jump in or have anything to say there.
That's great. Okay, we just have another question regarding this sedentary behaviour. So, Breed, we might direct this one towards you. So you gave a great overview that around 455 minutes of sedentary behaviour in Irish teenagers overall. I'm just wondering, was there any specific detail around screen time and any recommendations there?
Yeah, we have it broken up into screen time. I'm going to take a look at my notes because I can't remember off the top of my head. But we did, as I said in the presentation, we did apply the cutoff. So there isn't, I suppose, an official cutoff in terms of screen time. It is advisable that we reduce, or children reduce, the amount of screen time. But the UK have come up with a recommendation that it should be less than 120 minutes, 2 hours a day of screen time. And what we were seeing is that 21% of the population, if I'm right, didn't, or were meeting that recommendation. So it was quite low. And interestingly, when we looked at across age, is that there were less amount of older teenagers meeting that recommendation. So it seems that the sedentary activity increases potentially as they get older. So it's something that we should kind of look into and I suppose be concerned about. And maybe it's a way that we could come up with strategies to try and decrease the amount of sedentary activity and become more, I suppose, active in daily life. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, sorry.
I have them here, Breed, if it helps, I can share them with you there. So it's 418 minutes a day, the median screen time intake is 418. Sorry, 231, sorry, 231. I'm looking at the end numbers here, I'm looking at a summary report, sorry, 231 minutes a day, so it's well over the 2 hours.
Yeah.
And then that's 236 for boys and 223 for girls.
That's great. Thanks very much, Jeanette and Breach. And we just have another question that's come in about the weight status from Suzanne, and she's noted that we didn't actually mention anything about the underweight for teenagers who are classified as having underweight status. So, Breach, I don't know if you have any detail on that.
Yeah, it was. I suppose I didn't put it into the results of the presentation. You probably can work it out from the figures, but overall in our population, when we looked at those classified as having underweight, or in IOTF, it's classified as grade thinness 1 to 3, it was 5% of the population. So if we contrast that to the original, the NTFS back in 2005 and 6, it was 3%. So there is a slight increase for about 2%, but they're very small numbers. And again, when you look at Growing Up in Ireland, when they reported they have it in their figures as well, they were reporting about a 6% being classified as underweight. So that's the prevalence of underweight that we're seeing in our population. Okay.
That's great. Thanks very much, Breach. Just another question that's come in around supplement use. So obviously micronutrient intakes, some micronutrients were low in Irish teenagers. Just wondering, does this reflect the supplement intakes as well as food? And Laura, I might direct that one towards you.
Yeah, so all of the data presented here are nutrient intakes from all sources, so from food sources and supplements as well. There was obviously, because there's only 14% consuming supplements, there was a small contribution, and you'll all be able to see it when we have the summary report up on the web. The pie charts were the sources. Supplements, you know, they did feature for some nutrients such as vitamin D, but they really were not a key source because of the low consumption of them. There was just 7% of teenagers were taking a supplement that contained vitamin D. And then the supplements also featured quite a small source for example, some of the B vitamins, iron, etc. But they were quite low just because of the small amount using supplements. But also, I suppose, for certain nutrients, for example, iron, you know, you're going to get it from your other sources. They're still consuming, 98% of them are eating meat. For vitamin D, the key sources were coming from primarily like fortified foods, and then your eggs and your fish to a small extent as well. So yeah, if anyone wants to jump in or has anything else to add, I hope that's answered the question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Laura. That's actually all the questions that have come in. I'm not sure if anyone else, any of our attendees, would like to add anything before I pass back over to, oh, we have one come in. So we have a question that's come in from Orna. And she's just thanking us for a great presentation and asking a question around that teens from disadvantaged backgrounds were underrepresented in the survey. And can we shed some more light on how we corrected for this? So
I can jump in and then someone can follow up. Yeah, I suppose with these surveys, it's probably not new news. It's trying to get those lower social classes included is difficult. And in the children's, we had to do the same. We had slightly, now it wasn't too far off the actual population census when we look at social class, but we had a slight variation in that we felt that it would be better to weight the data. So we weight the data in a sense that we weight it towards what it should represent. So all data that we presented here, apart from, I should say, when I looked at social class across the weight status, because obviously I can't weight it for social class during that, but all the data we presented here and all the data in the summary report is weighted in that way. So it's more representative of our population. But to note, it is a small variation that we were seeing. So that's how we do it. I'm not sure if anyone wants to follow that up. I think I've got it right.
Yeah, sounds right. We do have another question that's come in, so it's around the fortified foods. So Laura, this might be best place for you. So what influence did fortified foods have on micronutrient intakes as opposed to whole food sources? And maybe that we haven't got to that stage yet, I'm not sure.
Yeah, so, well, if anyone, maybe the person knows me, but this is definitely an area that I'm really interested in looking at. I suppose we haven't had the opportunity to delve into that, and we have a PhD student working on that as well. So it will be a little bit of time before we have that kind of concrete data. But from the sources, we can see, for example, ready-to-eat breakfast cereals, fortifieds, ready-to-eat breakfast cereals are one of the key contributors to vitamin D, iron, B vitamins like the B2, B6, and dietary folate equivalents. There was other kind of fortified foods, such as some foods, some milks, etc., that were fortified with vitamin D, and they are a source, not a very key source, because obviously of that lower intake of milk and things like that. So we don't have the full answers on that one yet, but we definitely will, and it's an area of interest of mine as well. I'm excited to look at that we get there, but there's such a wealth of data here to mine through. We just haven't got those solid kind of answers just yet, or particular numbers on that. But keep an eye on the website, as you said, Aisling, and Twitter.
Yeah, exactly. Everything will be uploaded there. And someone has actually just asked a question around the recording of today's webinar. So that will be uploaded to the website in the near future as well. And there's just one further question. Once again, I'm not sure if we have got to this stage of analysis yet, but Sarah is wondering about the ethnic profile of the sample of teens. And Breach, maybe you might know more about the demographics.
No, you've thrown me because I don't know the figures off the top of my head, but it is representative in terms of the ethnicity as well. When we did look at it, but I can't remember the percentage that were included. The way in which we do this, as Jeanette alluded to, you know, we go to the schools and request permission to contact the children, so we get it nationally representative through that way for going across the country to various schools from different, I suppose, DESH schools to, you know, different types of schools as well. So we try and get it balanced in that way, but off the top of my head I can't remember, but we will be reporting on that on our findings later on in the year.
Great. And actually there's another question that's come in, Breach, that might also be best suited to you. So just given the composition changes in bottled beverages, do you plan on looking at changes in artificial sweetener intake? I know that's something that you've looked at previously.
Yeah, it really interests me. Yeah, I'd love to look at sweetener intakes, and I think it's vitally important when we change the composition of foods that we assess what impact that change has. And one of those is obviously with the sugar tax coming in. It's not only, I suppose, bottled drinks per se. We do see that whole reformulation and the increased use of sweeteners and different types of sweeteners, of course, that are on the stevia that's on the market now is the more natural form. So yes, I think, you know, and the FSAI do great job in risk assessment as well. So they cover this area in relation to chemical exposure. So definitely it is very interesting to see if we can can see that change, and it would be lovely to do it in relation to, I suppose, not only in our teens but our children as well, to look at, you know, that differing composition that we potentially see, or the different intakes of sweeteners that potentially over time we have observed. So we're unique, and I suppose one, that we have this valuable resource and, you know, such rich data that hopefully we will, if time and money is available, we'll be able to do more work in that area. Yeah.
That's great. Thanks very much, Breach. Just to iterate to all the panelists and to everyone, there's obviously a lot of people saying thank you very much for the presentations today. So thanks very much. And I'll pass over to Breach now just to conclude.
I'm going to, before I conclude, because I'm conscious, because I've John and Albert here, and I don't want to let it go without, maybe if and Jeanette as well, if you want to put forward your comments on, to put you on the spot, sorry guys, but to put forward your maybe your thoughts and comments on the teen survey before I conclude. So I don't know, John, maybe if I come to you first.
Sure. Thanks, Breach, and thanks for this opportunity just to, I suppose, add some comments to the really, really good presentations that have been given by the three of you this morning. What I would, I suppose, what strikes me, I have to say, and I suppose I'm coming from the point of view of the barriers and the, you know, attitudes the teens have towards their food intakes and their physical activity patterns, is the relatively high number saying that it was quite difficult to eat healthily. And I just find that result quite interesting, especially in relation to the persistent low fruit and vegetable intakes, which I do think is, you know, a big public health nutrition issue, you know, at those levels around 200, which is kind of almost, you know, just over 50% of recommended intake. So I do think a point that you alluded to earlier, that maybe, you know, our eyes are sort of very strongly in our actions on, you know, the earlier years, and it shows that perhaps we do need as well, not to kind of exclude, but as well to focus on this group. And I mean, I think those results on, you know, the levels of obesity are certainly going to have to be addressed. And whether that's through the diet or activity side, or maybe the high sedentarism, you know, which is there too, I think is something which needs to be looked at from a kind of a public health perspective. I mean, I was encouraged in one way to see quite good participation levels in physical activities. So, you know, there were some positive findings there. So, you know, certainly very interesting results, and ones that I do think highlight the need for intervention and for action.
Yeah, I agree. Albert, I'm going to pass it over to you for your thoughts.
Thank you, Bridge. Yes, just a few brief comments. First of all, we've seen the presentation of a wonderful collection of data from this survey, which adds to what has been collected over the years in the National Nutrition Surveys. And these data, as we know, will be very valuable to those agencies involved in regulation, such as Food Safety Authority of Ireland, in policy, Safe Food, Department of Health, HSE, etc., and to the industry. So these data are very widely used and will be of great value to all of these stakeholders. I'd just like to congratulate the team, because this is probably the most challenging of all the population groups to survey. The teens, as we know, can be the most difficult to survey, and that has been our experience in the past, and again it was here, and we've been so lucky to have such a great team that could stick with it. And today it's so gratifying to see the wonderful results that we've had from this great effort. So again, congratulations to all that have been involved. And there are some important findings. What is always interesting to me is to see how diet changes over time. And we have now this 15-year time period where we can see some of the trends that have occurred over that period of time. Changes are slow, but over that period of time, we can see quite a number of significant ones. So you see, for example, important changes for nutrition, such as reduction of milk. We see important changes on reduction of sugar and sugar-sweetened beverages, reduction of salt. Dietary changes are slow, but we can see over that period of time that there are significant changes, some of them for the better and some of them not. And this is very important for policymakers to be aware of how policy is influencing the national diet. I think in relation to body weight, this is always a big issue, and the trend in increasing body weight has continued for this group, as we've seen in other countries. And one of the dramatic things that always comes out of it, and we've seen it here in the results today, is how this links so closely to social class. And really, in addressing the issue of overweight and obesity for this group, and perhaps I think also for others, is that I think there just needs to be more attention to the issue, how it relates to social class, and how we can deal with that issue in terms of policy development. Again, congratulations to all. This has been a really successful survey, and it's really gratifying to see the wonderful results.
Thank you, Albert. And I'm going to Jeanette, if you want to, before I wrap up.
Thanks very much, Breed. Yeah, so I think everything's been said, but just as we looked at the results over the last week or two, I think Breed and myself particularly, when we were looking through these results and trying to, I suppose, make a handle of these changes that are there. And I think we really felt that compared to the KID survey, it wasn't such good news, and we were trying to really understand why, and I suppose understand what the key things were that we wanted to address. And I suppose one of the things is there is some good news, 850 mils of water on average, for teenage drinking. That's really, really nice to see. And but then when you, and the reduction in sugar sweetened beverages, but I suppose what really, I don't know if to use the word concerned, but really kind of brought home to us is for the first time in a while, we're really, really showing low intakes of micronutrients, and really important micronutrients for this age group. And as a mum of 2 teenage boys, I was really, really looking at these data in a personal way as much as a public and policy way. And I was thinking, really, with their reduction in breakfast cereal compared to younger children, and their reduction in milk intake, their low fruit and vegetable intake, I think we really need to address these things that are kind of a given in children that, when parents have so much influence on what the children are eating. And even though 80% of their calories are consumed in the home, it'll be interesting when we look into John's data a bit more to understand how much of it is influenced by parents, or is their own influences in the home, because this isn't all down to likes and dislikes, I'm thinking. I think a bit of it is the convenience and availability, the peers and what's going on. So I think we were kind of saying earlier a forgotten age group, because as we move to independence, where's the control level? So I think we need a bit of time to digest these data. They're very, very new for us as well as they are for you. And I think we need a little time to digest these and to work deeper into the data to understand for those that are meeting these recommendations, because there are some in each of these recommendations, there are a cohort that are meeting them. So I think once we understand a little bit more about what's different about them, how they're consuming foods that will meet these micronutrient, particularly recommendations, to understand a little bit more about that, and then maybe we'll be able to come up with some strategies that we can share and help, public bodies to bring forward. But I think there's a bit of work to do with this age group in terms of the sedentary behaviour, the prevalence of overweight and obesity. But I think for me, the micronutrients really threw me, because particularly for this age group going through puberty and growing, and this is their, and we looked at this at the 18 to 35-year-olds as well, and this is really their last chance. I'm gone beyond it now, but you only get so long for your peak bone mass, and I think there's no lecture that I ever go into in college that I don't mention peak bone mass because of teaching that age group. But you only get one chance, and I think for me, I think it is that reduction in milk is bothering me, and the low intakes of vitamin D and calcium. So that's where I am.
Thanks, Jeanette, that's great. Okay, so I'm going to, firstly, I want to thank the panelists today. It's a great pleasure to working with you as always, but thank you for today and for the discussion, and of course all you attendees who stayed with us. I'm just going to share one more screen because to wrap it up. So it's just about the dissemination, and in case there's any questions. Sorry, my last, but the summary report, so we've mentioned it throughout, but we will produce, and we have produced a summary report, and that will hopefully be released tomorrow and it will be available, as Jeanette had alluded to earlier, on www.iuna.net. So you'll be able to download your copy of your summary report at that point. And the full report, so we will do a full report and more detailed methodology and data analysis, and that will be released later this year. And just for those that wanted to note about this webinar, we are recording it, and that and the presentations that we've given today will be again available on iuna.net, and hopefully we will have them up tomorrow as well there. And to finally just to acknowledge, and I know we've acknowledged them throughout, but a huge team behind us. It's not just us, it's the field workers, the research assistants, the PhD students, the postdocs, you know, a massive team that are here undertaking this, you know, surveys to bring us this data. So real massive thank you to the whole team. And a special thanks to the teenagers themselves that take part. As Albert alluded to again, this is a particular hard group in all the different population groups that we've looked at. Teenagers are always hard. But I really want to say thank you to them and to their families for getting involved in the NTFS too, because without them, we wouldn't have the data in the first place. So thank you. So I'll just leave it there and say thank you, and I hope you've enjoyed our launch. Hopefully we'll see you all in person very soon. Thank you.